Book 2, Tom Outland's story, Section 5, of The Professor's House by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Book 2, Tom Outland's story, Section 5. The 1st of August came, and everything was going well with us. We hadn't met with any bad luck, and though we had very little money left, there was Blake's untouched savings account in the bank at Pardee, and we had plenty of credit in Tarpon. The merchants there took an interest and were friendly, but the little new moon that looked so innocent brought us trouble. We lost old Henry, and in a terrible way. From the first we'd been a little bothered by rattlesnakes. You generally find them about old stone quarries and old masonry. We had got them pretty well cleared out of the Cliff City, hadn't seen one there for weeks. But one Sunday we took Henry and went on an exploring expedition at the north end of the mesa, along Black Canyon. We caught sight of a little bunch of ruins we'd never noticed before, and made a foolhardy scramble to get up to them. We almost made it, and then there was a stretch of rock wall so smooth we couldn't climb it without a ladder. I was the tallest of the three, and Henry was the lightest. He thought he could get up there if he stood on my shoulders. He was standing on my back, his head just above the floor of the cavern, groping for something to hoist himself by, when a snake struck him from the ledge, struck him square in the forehead. It happened in a flash. He came down and brought the snake with him. By the time we picked him up and turned him over, his face had begun to swell. In 10 minutes it was purple, and he was so crazy it took the two of us to hold him and keep him from jumping down the chasm. He was struck so near the brain that there was nothing to do. It lasted nearly 2 hours. Then we carried him home. Roddy dropped down the ladder into Cow Canyon, caught his horse, and rode into Tarpon for the coroner. Father Duchesne was preaching there at the mission church that Sunday, and came back with him. We buried Henry on the mesa. Father Duchesne stayed on with us a week to keep us company. We were so cut up that we were almost ready to quit, but he had been planning to come out to see our find for a long while, and he got our minds off our trouble. He worked hard every day. He went over everything we'd done and examined everything minutely, the pottery, cloth, stone implements, and the remains of food. He measured the heads of the mummies and declared they had good skulls. He cut down one of the old cedars that grew exactly in the middle of the deep trail worn in the stone, and counted the rings under his pocket microscope. You couldn't count them with the unassisted eye, for growing out of a tiny crevice in the rock as that tree did, the increase of each year was so scant that the rings were invisible except with a glass. The tree he cut down registered 336 years' growth, and it could have begun to grow in that well-worn path only after human feet had ceased to come and go there. Why had they ceased? That question puzzled him, too. Smallpox, any epidemic, would have left unburied bodies. Father Duchesne suggested what Dr. Ripley in Washington afterward surmised, that the tribe had been exterminated, not here in their stronghold, but in their summer camp, down among the farms across the river. Father Duchesne had been among the Indians nearly 20 years then. He had 17 Indian pueblos in his parish, and he spoke several Indian dialects. He was able to explain the use of many of the implements we found, especially those used in religious ceremonies. The night before he left us, he summed up the results of his week's study, something like this. The 2 square towers on the mesa top, to which you have given little attention, were unquestionably granaries. Under the stones and earth fallen from the walls, there is a quantity of dried corn on the ear. Not a great harvest, for life must have come to an end here in the summer, when the new crop was not yet garnered, and the last year's grain was getting low. The semicircular ridge on the mesa top, which you can see distinctly among the pinyons when the sun is low, and brings it into high relief, is the buried wall of an amphitheater, where probably religious exercises and games took place. I advise you not to dig into it. It is probably the most important thing here, and should be left for scholars to excavate. The tower you so much admire in the cliff village may have been a watchtower, as you think, but from the curious placing of those narrow slits, like windows, I believe it was used for astronomical observations. I am inclined to think that your tribe were a superior people. Perhaps they were not so when they first came upon this mesa, but in an orderly and secure life they developed considerably the arts of peace. There is evidence on every hand that they lived for something more than food and shelter. They had an appreciation of comfort and went even further than that. Their life, compared to that of our roving Navajos, must have been quite complex. There is unquestionably a distinct feeling for design in what you call the Cliff City. Buildings are not grouped like that by pure accident, though convenience probably had much to do with it. Convenience often dictates very sound design. The workmanship on both the wood and stone of the dwellings is good. The shapes and decoration of the water jars and food bowls is better than in any of the existing pueblos I know, better even than the pottery made at Acoma. I have seen a collection of early pottery from the island of Crete. Many of the geometrical decorations on these jars are not only similar, but, if my memory is trustworthy, identical. I see your tribe as a provident, rather thoughtful people, who made their livelihood secure by raising crops and fowl. The great number of turkey bones and feathers are evidence that they had domesticated the wild turkey. With grain in their storerooms and mountain sheep and deer for their quarry, they rose gradually from the condition of savagery. With the proper variation of meat and vegetable diet, they developed physically and improved in the primitive arts. They had looms and mills and experimented with dyes. At the same time, they possibly declined in the arts of war, in brute strength and ferocity. I see them here, isolated, cut off from other tribes, working out their destiny, making their mesa more and more worthy to be a home for man, purifying life by religious ceremonies and observances, caring respectfully for their dead, protecting the children, doubtless entertaining some feelings of affection and sentiment for this stronghold, where they were at once so safe and so comfortable, where they had practically overcome the worst hardships that primitive man had to fear. They were, perhaps, too far advanced for their time and environment. They were probably wiped out, utterly exterminated by some roving Indian tribe without culture or domestic virtues, some horde that fell upon them in their summer camp and destroyed them for their hides and clothing and weapons, or from mere love of slaughter. I feel sure that these brutal invaders never even learned of the existence of this mesa, honeycombed with habitations. If they had come here, they would have destroyed. They killed and went their way. What I cannot understand is why you have not found more human remains. The 3 bodies you found in the mortuary chamber were prepared for burial by the old people who were left behind. But what of the last survivors? It is possible that when autumn wore on, and no one returned from the farms, the aged banded together, went in search of their people, and perished in the plain. Like you, I feel a reverence for this place. Wherever humanity has made that hardest of all starts and lifted itself out of mere brutality is a sacred spot. Your people were cut off here without the influence of example or emulation, with no incentive but some natural yearning for order and security. They built themselves into this mesa and humanized it. Father Duchesne warmly agreed with Blake that I ought to go to Washington and make some report to the government. so that the proper specialists would be sent out to study the remains we had found. "You must go to the director of the Smithsonian Institution," he said. "He will send us an archaeologist who will interpret all that is obscure to us. He will revive this civilization in a scholarly work. It may be that you will have thrown light on some important points in the history of your country." After he left us, Blake and I began to make definite plans for my trip to Washington. Blake was to work on the railroad that winter and save as much money as possible. The expense of my journey would be paid out of what we called the jackpot account in the bank at Pardee. All our further expenses on the mesa would be paid by the government. Roddy often hinted that we would get a substantial reward of some kind. When we broke or lost anything at our work, he used to smile and say, "Never mind, I guess our Uncle Sam will make that good to us." We had a beautiful autumn that year, soft, sunny like a dream. Even up there in the air we had so little wind that the gold hung on the poplars and quaking aspens late in November. We stayed out on the mesa until after Christmas. We wanted our archaeologist, when he came, to find everything in good order. We cleared up any litter we'd made in digging things out, stored all the specimens, even the mummies, in our cabin, and padlocked the doors and windows before we left it. I had written up my daybook carefully to the very end, had even written out some of Father Duchesne's deductions. This book I left in concealment on the mesa. I climbed up to the eagle's nest in which we had found the mummy of the murdered woman we called Mother Eve, where I had noticed a particularly neat little cupboard in the wall. I put my book in this niche and sealed it up with cement. Mother Eve had greatly interested Father Duchesne, by the way. He laughed and said she was well named. He didn't believe her death could throw any light on the destruction of her people. "I seem to smell," he said slyly, "a personal tragedy. Perhaps when the tribe went down to the summer camp, Our Lady was sick and would not go. Perhaps her husband thought it worth while to return unannounced from the farm some night and found her in improper company. The young man may have escaped. In primitive society, the husband is allowed to punish an unfaithful wife with death." When the first snow began to fly, we said goodbye to our mesa and rode into Tarpon. It took several days to outfit me for my journey to Washington. We bought a trunk — I'd never owned one in my life — and a supply of white shirts, an overcoat that was as heavy as lead and just about as cold, and 2 suits of clothes. That conscienceless trader worked off on me a claw-hammer coat he must have had in stock for 20 years. He easily persuaded Roddy that it was the proper thing for dress occasions. I think Roddy expected that I would be received by ambassadors. Perhaps I did. Roddy drew $600 out of the bank to stake me and bought my ticket and Pullman through to Washington. He went to the station with me the morning I left, and a hard handshake was goodbye. For a long while after my train pulled out, I could see our mesa bulking up blue on the skyline. I hated to leave it, but I reflected that it had taken care of itself without me for a good many 100 years. When I saw it again, I told myself I would have done my duty by it. I would bring back with me men who would understand it, who would appreciate it, and dig out all its secrets. End of Book 2, Tom Outland Story, Section 5.